In that house, silence wasn't peace. It was survival. When the jingle of keys in the lock announced his arrival, I learned to become invisible, to breathe so softly that not even angels could hear me. Even so, he would come to my room, and my nightmare would begin. Before I introduce myself, please comment where you're watching this video from in the comments section below. I'm always so happy when you interact with me. My name is Dorothy Fields. I'm 79 years old, and I've lived here in Springfield, Massachusetts, since I was a little girl. Today, thanks to God, I have this simple but clean and tidy home, with my plants in the backyard and my pictures on the walls. Looking at me now, an old woman with white hair and wrinkled hands, you'd never imagine the story I carry in my heart. A story I've kept silent for more than 60 years. My grandchildren always ask me to tell them stories from when I was little, but I always make up something nice. A trip to Boston, a game of hopscotch. The truth? Oh my dear, the truth I never had the courage to tell anyone. Until today. When night falls and I'm alone in this house, sometimes I smell those medicines and wake up frightened, feeling my body heavy as if I were still under the effect of those drugs. I was born in 1946, at a time when children, especially girls, had no voice or choice. My father, Dr. Gerald Fields, was the most respected doctor in town. Everyone greeted him on the street, tipped their hat when he passed by. Everyone thought he was an exemplary man, a saint for being so good to his patients, attending to poor people in the middle of the night, sometimes not even charging those who couldn't pay. Dr. Fields is an angel, people would say, if they only knew. At home, away from society's eyes, he was a monster. Not a monster who yelled and broke things. No, it was worse. He was a silent, calculating monster who used his medical knowledge to control everything and everyone around him. Mom, Margaret, lived more drugged than awake. Anything she did that displeased him, any opinion different from his, and he would come with an injection, a pill in her water, something to calm her nerves. A wife of mine doesn't raise her voice, doesn't question, doesn't bother, he would say, when he thought I wasn't listening. Sometimes Mom would spend entire days sleeping or walking around the house like a ghost, empty-eyed, talking nonsense. I was very young and didn't really understand what was happening. I thought my mother was actually sick, that she needed all those medicines. Our house was on a large lot, set back from the town center. It was a beautiful, big house, one of those old ones with a porch in front and a huge backyard. From the outside, it looked like a perfect home. Inside, it was a prison. The windows were always closed, the curtains always drawn. A doctor needs privacy, my father would say, when some neighbor asked why our house always seemed empty, lifeless. We had a housekeeper, Mrs. Sarah, who lived with us, an older woman, thin with downcast eyes, who did everything my father ordered without ever questioning. She saw everything, knew everything, but pretended not to see, not to know. It was as if she were deliberately blind and deaf. Today I understand, poor thing. She was afraid of losing her job, of being left on the street. In those days, a woman without education, without family, didn't have many options in life. When I was about 7, I began to understand that something was very wrong in our house. I remember once when I was invited to a neighbor girl's birthday party. It was the first time I'd been invited to anything. I was so happy, spent the whole day dreaming about the cake, the games, the chance to have friends. When Dad came home, I ran to tell him, all excited. "Party? Who gave you permission to accept a party invitation?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes cold as ice. I explained that the girl's mother had spoken with Mrs. Sarah, who had said it was fine. In my house, I decide what's fine. That night, when Mom tried to intercede for me, saying it would do me good to play with other children, he simply opened that black bag he carried everywhere, took out a syringe, filled it with a transparent liquid, and injected it into her arm right there in front of everyone at the dinner table. "You're very nervous, Margaret. You need to rest." In minutes, Mom's head had fallen onto her plate, her eyes rolling, her mouth slack. He picked her up and carried her to the bedroom. When he returned, he pointed his finger at me. "See what you did? You made your mother nervous with this party business. Go to your room and don't come out until tomorrow." I went, of course. I learned early that disobeying only made things worse. I lay on my bed, hugging my only toy, a rag doll that Mrs. Sarah had made for me in secret, and cried softly so no one would hear. Through the door crack, I saw when he returned to the living room, sat in the armchair with a glass of whiskey, and just sat there, staring into space, as if satisfied with what he had done. That was the first time I felt afraid of him. Not the normal fear a child has of getting scolded or being punished, but a deep, visceral fear. The kind of fear that makes you feel cold in your stomach, even when it's hot. The kind of fear that makes you learn to walk on tiptoe, to breathe without making noise, to live like a shadow in your own home. At school, I was the quiet girl, the one who never participated in games, who sat in the back and didn't talk to anyone. The teachers thought I was shy. Dr. Fields's daughter, so well behaved, such an example, they would say at meetings. If they only knew that I was quiet out of fear, that I behaved because I knew what would happen if any complaints reached my father's ears. There were days when he came home in a good mood, brought sweets, spoke softly, even seemed like a normal father. On these days, I would cheer up, think that maybe things could get better. But all it took was for Mom to say something he didn't like, or for me to make too much noise playing. And there came that look, that way of his that meant the storm was coming. When I was 10, I began to feel firsthand what my mother was going through. It was on a Sunday afternoon. Father had invited some fellow doctors over for lunch, a rare thing. The house was all fixed up. Mrs. Sarah spent the day in the kitchen preparing the food he liked. Mom, who that day was less drugged, helped me put on a nice dress, brushed my hair with ribbons. "You're going to behave nicely, aren't you?" she said, adjusting my bow. "You'll show that you're a well-mannered girl." Deep in her eyes, I saw the fear, the same fear I felt. The lunch went well at first. My father's colleagues talked about medical cases, politics, things I didn't understand. I stayed quiet, only answered when someone directly addressed me, until one of the doctors, Dr. Michael, asked me, "And you, Dorothy? What do you want to be when you grow up?" Before I could think, I answered excitedly, "I want to be a doctor like Daddy." It was true. Despite everything, I admired how people respected my father, how important he seemed when he saved someone's life. A silence fell over the table. My father's smile, which until then had seemed plastered on his face, disappeared. "Girls don't need that much education," he said with a forced laugh. "Dorothy will be a good wife like her mother. Why overburden that little head with medicine?" The other doctors laughed, agreed. Dr. Michael shrugged. "It's true, Gerald. Why spoil a little flower like her with books? Let her embroider, cook, take care of the house." I felt as if they had thrown a bucket of cold water on me. But the worst was yet to come. When everyone left, my father called me to his office. That room where no one entered without permission, full of medical books, with that strong smell of alcohol and other products I didn't know. "Who put this idea in your head?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, which was always more frightening than when he shouted. "Was it your mother? Was it that meddlesome housekeeper?" "No one, Daddy," I answered, trembling. I just wanted to be like you." He looked at me for a long time, as if seeing something beyond me. Then he opened a drawer, took out a syringe and a small vial. "You want to know what it's like to be a doctor? I'll show you." Before I could react, he grabbed my arm firmly, stuck in the needle, and injected whatever that liquid was. "This is for you to learn not to say foolish things in front of guests. A doctor needs to know how to control difficult patients." The world began to spin. My vision blurred. I felt my body heavy, as if I were sinking in a river of mud. I couldn't move my arms, my legs. I wanted to scream, but my tongue seemed too big for my mouth. The last thing I saw was my father's face, observing with scientific curiosity, as if I were one of his experiments. I woke up in my room. It was already night. My head hurt, my mouth was dry as paper. I tried to get up, but my body still wasn't obeying properly. Through the half-open door, I heard my mother crying in the living room, begging, "Please, Gerald, she's just a child. Don't do this to her." "Shut up, Margaret," his voice, always controlled. "I'm just teaching discipline. Or would you prefer she grow up with absurd ideas?" making a fool of herself? From that day on, any slip, any word out of place, any low grade at school was reason for him to calm me down with his drugs. Sometimes it was a pill crushed in my food. Other times an injection, he said, was vitamins to grow strong. I learned to recognize the signs, the bitter taste in the juice, the way the water seemed a little cloudy. I tried to avoid it, pretend I was drinking, that I was eating. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a doctor. He knew exactly what he was doing. The years passed, and that dreamy little girl who once wanted to be a doctor was disappearing. In her place was a quiet, frightened teenager who could barely look people in the eye. At school, I was invisible. At home, I was a shadow. My mother, increasingly absent, spent her days lying down, staring at the ceiling, saying things that made no sense. Mrs. Sarah, the only witness to our misfortune, kept her eyes down, pretended not to see. Just once, only once, did she try to help me. I was about 12 and had a high fever after one of my father's medications. He had gone out to attend to an emergency, and she took the opportunity to give me some tea, put cold compresses on my forehead. "Child," she whispered, looking around as if the walls could hear, "what your father does isn't right. That's not how you treat a daughter, a wife." "Then why don't you do anything?" I asked, the words coming out dragged by weakness. She lowered her eyes, ashamed. "And what can an old black woman like me do against a doctor? Who would believe me? I'd just lose my job, be on the street, and you would be here without anyone." She was right, of course. In those days, in that place, the word of a respected doctor was worth more than anything. Who would believe the stories of a domestic servant, of a mentally unstable wife, of a problematic and lying child? So we continued, prisoners in our own home, living in the shadow of the great doctor, Gerald Fields, the man everyone admired on the street and we feared within four walls. I grew up accustomed to that constant fear, to the bitter taste of the medicines, to the sensation of always being half asleep, half awake. That's how he wanted us, docile, controlled, without will of our own. You must be thinking, but didn't anyone suspect anything? Didn't anyone notice? Look, in those days, what happened inside the home was a family matter. Nobody interfered. And even if someone suspected, who would have the courage to confront a respected doctor like my father? He had an answer for everything. If Mom appeared somewhat groggy somewhere, it was because she suffered from nerves. If I was too quiet, too apathetic, it was because I was a shy, well-mannered girl. And everyone believed it, because they wanted to believe it. It was easier, more comfortable than admitting that a man like him could do what he did. That's how it was until I was 15, when something happened that would change everything, something that would give me the strength I didn't know I had to finally confront the monster in our house. It was in the winter of 1961 that I began to plan our escape. I had just turned 15, and things at home were getting worse every day. Mom hardly spoke anymore, living in a state between sleep and wakefulness, her eyes always empty, as if her soul had departed long ago, leaving only the body behind. That year, Father had been invited to teach at the medical school in Boston. This meant he spent 3 days of the week away, returning only on weekends. It was in those small intervals of freedom that I began to see the world with different eyes, to breathe without that constant fear squeezing my chest. When he wasn't there, the house seemed different, lighter. Mrs. Sarah hummed softly while doing her chores. I could read the books I found hidden in the library without fear of being punished. And even Mom seemed to awaken a bit from her lethargic state. It was on one of those afternoons that I found her diary, hidden in an old sewing box at the bottom of the wardrobe. A small notebook with a faded blue cover, with pages yellowed by time. Her handwriting, which began firm and elegant in the first pages, became trembling and confused as the years passed. Gerald applied another medicine today, said it was for my own good, to control my anxiety. But I'm not anxious. I just want to live, breathe, be myself. Each day it gets harder to remember who I was before him. I read those words and cried. Cried, as I had never allowed myself to cry before. It was confirmation of something that deep down I always knew. My mother wasn't sick. She was a prisoner, just like me. In other pages, she talked about me. about how she felt guilty for not being able to protect me, for being too weak to confront him. Dorothy asked to go to the movies with her school friends today. Gerald said no, as always. When I tried to intercede, he gave me that injection that makes me sleep. I know she saw me passing out. What kind of mother am I, who can't even defend my own daughter? The discovery of that diary changed something inside me. The frightened girl began to give way to a young woman determined to change that situation. If he could control us with his drugs, maybe we could use that against him. It was a dangerous thought, I knew, but for the first time in my life, I felt that I had a chance. I began to observe my father with different eyes, studying him as he studied his patients. I noticed that he kept his special medications, as he called them, in a locked cabinet in his office. The key was always in his lab coat pocket, except when he took a shower. It was a small window of opportunity, but it was all I had. On a Friday when he returned from Boston, I waited for him to go to the bathroom. As soon as I heard the shower running, I ran to the bedroom and, with my heart beating so hard I thought it could be heard throughout the house, I slipped my hand into the pocket of the lab coat hanging behind the door. I found the key, small and silver, exactly as I had imagined it would be. With it firm between my fingers, I ran to the office. My hands were shaking so much I could barely fit it in the lock. When the cabinet finally opened, I saw dozens of vials, all organized, all labeled with my father's precise handwriting. I didn't know exactly what to look for. I knew the effects, not the names. I searched for something that looked familiar, some vial I had seen in his hands before falling into induced sleep. And then I saw a small vial with a transparent liquid, carefully labeled pentothal 5%, controlled use. Next to it, several syringes still in their packages. My fingers touched the cold glass, and on impulse, I put the vial in my dress pocket and a syringe in my sleeve. I returned to my room, my heart almost coming out of my mouth, and hid my small treasure under the mattress. I returned the key to the lab coat seconds before hearing the shower being turned off. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, wondering if what I was planning was madness, if it would end up killing us all. But then I remembered Mom's diary, her words, the silent suffering we had lived for so many years, and I knew I had no choice. For days, I studied my father, his habits, his routines. I noticed how he always had a glass of whiskey before bed, how he checked on Mom to make sure she was sedated enough. I realized that when he drank, he became less attentive, less careful. It was then that fate, or perhaps God, placed the perfect opportunity in my hands. Father announced that he would be receiving an important colleague for dinner that Saturday. "I want the house impeccable," he ordered, "and you, Margaret, are going to behave. None of that appearing drugged or confused. Tonight is crucial for my career." For the first time in years, he didn't give Mom any medication that day. He wanted her to seem normal, the perfect wife to impress the guest. I had to stop myself from laughing at the irony. The only night he wanted her lucid was precisely the night I planned to act. The dinner proceeded with a palpable tension that only we prisoners of that house could feel. The guest, an older doctor, seemed delighted with Dr. Fields's perfect family. Mom, still weak but more alert than I had seen her in years, maintained a polite smile on her face. I served the table in silence, as I had been ordered. When everyone had finished eating and the men had gone to the office to have their whiskey and smoke their cigars, I had my chance. Carefully, I removed the vial and the syringe from my hiding place. My hands were trembling so much that I almost dropped it as I prepared the dose, which, if my calculations were correct, and I prayed they were, would be enough to knock him out, but not kill him. I went to the kitchen where Mrs. Sarah was preparing the coffee that would be served to the men. "What are you doing here, child?" she asked, the surprise evident in her eyes. "Your father said to stay in your room after dinner." "I came to help with the coffee," I replied, trying to appear calm. "Let me take it to them." She looked at me suspiciously, but said nothing, probably too tired to argue. When she turned to get the cookies, I quickly injected the liquid into the cup that would be my father's. I knew which one was his by the specific design, a cup only he used, with the emblem of the medical school. I carried the tray to the office, my heart beating so hard I thought they could hear it. I served the guest first, then my father, avoiding looking directly at him. I feared he could see in my eyes what I had done. "You may leave now," ordered my father, without even looking at me. I returned to the kitchen and through the cracks in the door observed them. They talked, drank the coffee. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, and I began to think I had failed, that the dose was insufficient, or that I had gotten the wrong cup. Then my father began to blink several times, as if trying to ward off sleep. His speech became slurred, the words jumbling together. The guest seemed concerned, asked if he was all right. "Just tired," my father replied, his voice already distant. And then, to the horror of the guest and my guilty relief, he collapsed in the armchair, unconscious. What followed was a confusion. The guest called for Mrs. Sarah, who ran to the office. They called another doctor, a close friend of my father's. The official explanation was exhaustion due to overwork. No one suspected the quiet daughter, the invisible girl who always obeyed. While the doctors examined my father in the bedroom, I ran to my mother's room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking confused, frightened by all the commotion. "Mom," I whispered, taking her cold hands in mine. "We need to talk now." I told her everything about the diary I had found, about the drugs he gave us, about how I had finally reversed the situation. I spoke quickly, with urgency, fearing that at any moment he might wake up. "We can't live like this anymore," I concluded, tears streaming down my face. "It's not life, Mom. It's prison. It's torture." I expected her to be horrified, to reprimand me, maybe even to tell the doctors what I had done. Instead, she looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in her eyes for years. "I know, my daughter," she said, squeezing my hands. "I know everything. I just didn't have the strength to fight." At that moment, we made our decision. It wouldn't be easy, we knew that. He was powerful, respected. We were just two fragile women without a voice. But we had something he didn't expect, the truth. And the truth, when finally revealed, can be a more powerful weapon than any drug. While the doctors were concerned with my father, who slept deeply, Mom and I began to put our plan into action. First, we recovered her diary, crucial evidence of what we had been suffering. Then we went to Father's office, taking advantage of the confusion, and opened that cursed cabinet. What we found was even worse than we had imagined. They weren't just medications to keep us docile. There were detailed notebooks, meticulous notes about the doses, the effects, as if we were his personal guinea pigs. Diaries of a man who used his own medical knowledge to control, to dominate, to torture. "He needs to pay for this," said Mom, her voice firm for the first time in years. "Not just for us, but so that he never does this to anyone else." I agreed, though I knew it would be almost impossible. Who would believe us against the word of a respected doctor? Even with all the evidence, it would be our word against his, and in the society of that time, a man's word always carried more weight. It was then that I had the idea that would change everything, a risky, dangerous idea, but one that could finally free us. "We need help," I told Mom. "Someone he can't intimidate, someone with enough influence to protect us." Oi. And so that same night, while my father was still unconscious, we did the most courageous and desperate thing of our lives. We took the evidence, the diaries, both his and Mom's, and walked out the front door without looking back. Our destination, the house of Bishop Thomas, the only person in town with enough moral authority to confront the respected Dr. Gerald Fields. The night was cold when we arrived at the Episcopal residence. The night guard looked at us suspiciously. 2 women alone at that hour, one of them visibly debilitated, the other just a teenager. Before I continue, I want to thank you for watching. Please let me know in the comments which part of the country you're listening from. It gives me such joy to imagine my story reaching places that I, an old woman from Springfield, Massachusetts, have never been able to visit. And if you're enjoying the Grandparents' Tales channel, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Each like is like a cup of coffee you're offering me while listening to my story. "We need to speak with Bishop Thomas," I insisted. "It's an emergency." He hesitated, but something in our desperate appearance must have convinced him. Minutes later, we were in the presence of the bishop, a white-haired man with a kind look who listened to us attentively as we told our horror story. When we finished, he remained silent for a long moment. I feared he wouldn't believe us, that he would call my father, that he would send us back to that hell. Instead, he stood up, walked to a shelf, and took an old Bible. "What you have told me is serious," he said finally. "So serious that I cannot act alone. But I promise you will not return to that house tonight, nor ever again, if that is what you wish." That same night, we were taken in at the home of a widow trusted by the bishop. For the first time in years, we slept without fear, without the shadow of my father hanging over us. What happened in the following days was like a whirlwind. Bishop Thomas convened a council that included the town sheriff, the judge, and an out-of-town doctor, someone who didn't owe favors to my father. The evidence was examined. Witnesses were heard. Mrs. Sarah, initially reluctant, ended up confirming our account, perhaps moved by remorse for having kept silent for so long. My father, when he found out, reacted exactly as we expected. He denied everything, said we were crazy, that Mom had mental problems and had influenced me with her fantasies. He even suggested that I should be institutionalized for my own good. But by this point, it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. The detailed records he himself had made, thinking they would never be discovered, now condemned him. Mom's diary, the needle marks on our arms, the testimonies. Even so, his prestige, his position, protected him from public condemnation. In small-town Springfield of 1961, a scandal of this magnitude would be unthinkable. Instead, he was offered a deal. He would renounce his rights over us, never seek us out again. And in exchange, the case would be handled discreetly as a divorce due to incompatibility, a common solution at the time. To my surprise, he accepted without hesitation. Perhaps because he realized he had lost control over us. Perhaps because he feared that if the case went to trial, other victims might appear. We never knew for sure. What I do know is that on a sunny day in September 1961, Mom and I were at a train station with just 2 small suitcases containing the little that truly belonged to us. Destination: New York City, where a distant cousin of Mom's had offered us shelter until we could establish ourselves. When the train began to move slowly, leaving behind the town that had been our prison for so many years, I saw Mom smile, a genuine, luminous smile that I hadn't seen since I was very small. "We're going to start over," she said, squeezing my hand. "We're going to truly live now." And that's exactly what we did. New York in 1961 was a completely different world from anything we had ever known. We got off at Grand Central Station with our 2 little cardboard suitcases and stood there, frightened by the crowd, the noise of the cars, the size of the buildings that seemed to touch the sky. We were 2 country girls from a small town, 2 survivors trying to start over from scratch. Mom's cousin, Mrs. Eleanor, was waiting for us on the platform. She was a woman in her 50s, a widow who worked as a seamstress in a workshop in the garment district. She hugged us without asking questions, something for which we will be eternally grateful. "Come, the bus is about to pass," was all she said, picking up one of the suitcases. Her apartment was small, 1 bedroom and a living room in an old building on 7th Avenue. The 3 of us shared the only bed like sardines in a can. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe, and that was worth more than any luxury. In the first days, Mom still suffered from the effects of withdrawal. The drugs my father had given her for so many years had left deep marks. She trembled, had cold sweats, sometimes screamed in her sleep. Mrs. Eleanor treated everything with admirable naturalness. "Margaret has frayed nerves," she would explain to the curious neighbors. "The move, you know how it is. It will pass." And it did pass. Slowly, like a flower that has been closed for a long time and slowly begins to open again to the sun, Mom came back to life. Her hands stopped trembling. Her eyes gained brightness. Her voice became firmer. It was a slow process, with setbacks and fears, but she was determined to live. Mrs. Eleanor got a job for Mom in the same workshop where she worked. Margaret always had a skill with needle and thread, though my father rarely let her exercise that talent. Now this skill would be our salvation. As for me, at 15, I needed to study. Bishop Thomas, before we left, had provided a letter of recommendation to St. Agnes School, run by nuns. Thanks to this letter and a partial scholarship, I was able to complete my education. Studying was like discovering a new world, a world my father had tried to deny me. For the first time, I could learn without fear of being punished for knowing too much, for asking questions, for existing. The nuns were strict, of course, but their strictness was predictable, based on clear rules, not on the unstable temper of a domestic tyrant. Meanwhile, we rented a small room in the back of a house in Queens. It was just one room with a shared bathroom in the yard, but it was ours, our first real home where we could come and go as we pleased, where no one drugged us, where the only key stayed with us. A seamstress's salary barely covered basic expenses, so after school, I helped at a grocery store near home, organizing shelves, attending to customers, making deliveries. The owner, Mr. Antonio, a kind-hearted Italian, always saved for us the fruits that were almost overripe, the day-old bread, the slightly dented cans that couldn't be sold at the regular price. "It's a waste to throw it away," he would say, though we all knew it was his way of helping without hurting our pride. The following years were of hard work and small achievements. In 1963, Mom got a better job in a fine clothing store downtown. Her skill with sewing impressed the owner, who came to trust her for the most delicate adjustments on the imported dresses she sold to wealthy New York ladies. With the better salary, we managed to rent a small, more decent apartment with our own bathroom, a luxury that someone who has never had to share a toilet with 10 other families cannot fully appreciate. I finished high school with excellent grades, and contrary to all expectations for a girl at that time, decided I wanted to continue studying. Not medicine as I had dreamed as a child. That dream had been contaminated by memories of my father. Instead, I chose teaching. Mom supported my decision without hesitation, though it meant 3 more years living on a tight budget. "Education is the only thing no one can take away from you," she would say, repeating the words of Professor Johnson, who had secretly lent me books when we still lived in Springfield. In 1964, while America was going through political transformations that we barely understood at the time, our small family of 2 women was also going through changes. Mom met Mr. Oscar, a widower who worked as an accountant in a textile factory. He frequented the store where she worked, always with the excuse of buying presents for a supposed niece who, we later discovered, didn't even exist. It was strange to see her being courted, to see a man treat her with the respect and kindness my father never showed. At first, I confess, I was afraid. What if this man also hid a monster behind his polite smile? What if he also wanted to control us, to subjugate us? I shared these fears with Mom one night after Mr. Oscar had taken us to dinner at an Italian restaurant in Little Italy, our first dinner in a real restaurant. "I'm afraid too, daughter," she confessed, sitting on the edge of my bed. "I think I always will be. Your father left scars that will never completely disappear, but we can't let fear prevent us from living, from trying to be happy." She was right, of course. We couldn't let my father continue controlling our lives, even from a distance. That would be giving him a victory he didn't deserve. Mom and Mr. Oscar's courtship progressed slowly, with the respect and caution that 2 mature people, both marked by difficult experiences, knew was necessary. He never imposed his presence, never tried to rush things, never took a step that wasn't welcome. In 1966, they got married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, followed by a lunch for a few friends at a modest restaurant. I, at 20, freshly graduated in teaching and already giving classes at a small neighborhood school, was the maid of honor. Seeing Mom in that light blue dress we had sewn together, a small bouquet of daisies in her hands, her face flushed with genuine happiness, was one of the most beautiful moments of my life. Mr. Oscar, now my stepfather, cried when she entered the courthouse room. Not a forced, theatrical cry, but silent tears from a man who wasn't ashamed to show his feelings. They went to live in a small but comfortable house in Sunnyside, Queens, which Mr. Oscar was paying for in installments. I stayed in our apartment, now paid for only with my teacher's salary, which meant even more economy, even more hours of work. But I was happy for Mom, to see her finally free and loved as she deserved. The late 60s brought changes and challenges. America was experiencing difficult times politically, and this affected everyone. The classrooms where I taught were getting more and more crowded with children whose parents worked long hours in the factories that were multiplying in the city. Many arrived hungry, with problems at home, with stories that, though different from mine, also spoke of violence, neglect, abandonment. It was during this time that I met Charles, a young history teacher who taught at the same school as me. He had ideals, dreams of a more just, more equal country. We would talk for hours after classes, planning projects to help the students, discussing books, exchanging ideas about education. Gradually, that professional friendship transformed into something more. It was a slow process, full of fears and hesitations on my part. Carrying the scars that I carried didn't make it easy to trust, much less to love. Charles was patient, respected my limits, never pushed me. When I finally told him about my past, about my father, about what we had lived through, he showed neither pity nor horror, only understanding. "You survived," he said, holding my hands. "That makes you the strongest person I've ever met." We married in 1968 in a simple but joy-filled ceremony. Mom and Mr. Oscar were there, of course, as was Mrs. Eleanor, who had become a kind of aunt to me. Our fellow teachers, some former students who had grown attached to us, the neighbors who had seen us grow and struggle, our small chosen family, the one we built far from the shadows of the past. Our honeymoon was in Atlantic City, 3 days by the sea in a simple little hotel. It was the first time I had seen the ocean, that blue immensity that seemed to have no end. Sitting on the sand, watching the waves, I felt a peace I never thought possible. "It's like the world is bigger and smaller at the same time, isn't it?" Charles commented, sitting beside me. "Bigger because we realize how much we don't know, smaller because we feel part of something immense." That was exactly it. In Springfield, under my father's yoke, the world was small, suffocating, limited to the walls of our prison house. Now, looking at the infinite horizon, I understood that there were unlimited possibilities, that my story was still being written, that the future could be whatever I wanted to make of it. Charles and I rented a small apartment in Brooklyn and continued teaching. In 1970, we were blessed with the arrival of our daughter, Cecilia, named in honor of the poet I so admired, and whose verses had given me strength in the darkest moments. Holding her in my arms for the first time was frightening and wonderful. Frightening because, like every new mother, I feared not being able to protect her, to guide her, to be the mother she deserved. Wonderful because in that small being, I saw a chance for a new beginning, a life that didn't carry the weight of the past. Looking at her, I promised myself that she would never know the kind of fear I had known, that she would grow up surrounded by love, respect, and freedom to be whoever she wanted to be. Cecilia grew up happy, curious, loved. Charles was the kind of father who would sit on the floor to play dolls, who read stories before bed, who answered each why with patience and sincerity. The kind of father I didn't have, the kind of man my father never was. But even in the happiness of the present, the past sometimes returned like a ghost. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming that I was back in that house, that my father was approaching me or Cecilia with a syringe in his hand. Charles learned to recognize these moments, to embrace me in silence until the storm passed, to remind me that we were safe, that no one could hurt us. Mom also had her moments of darkness, though as the years passed, they became more rare. Mr. Oscar, a man of few words but much sensitivity, knew how to bring her back when she got lost in memories, how to remind her of the good present we had built. In 1975, I received a letter from Mrs. Sarah, my family's former housekeeper in Springfield. She wrote to inform me that my father had died, a sudden stroke, according to her. He died alone in his office, and his body was only found the next day. The news caught me by surprise, not for its content. Death is part of life, and my father's was no exception, but for the absence of feeling it provoked in me. I felt no sadness, no anger, not even relief. It was like receiving news about a stranger, someone who no longer had any connection to me. "Do you want to go to the funeral?" Charles asked when I showed him the letter. I thought for a moment before answering, "No, that part of my life ended a long time ago." I have nothing to say to him, not even to God. That night, before going to sleep, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took Mom's old diary, which I had kept with me all those years, and reread some pages, not to torture myself with the memories, but to remind myself how far we had come, how far we were from that dark past. On the last page, written in the trembling handwriting of those times, Mom had written, I dreamed of freedom today. In the dream, Dorothy and I were on a beach. The sun was shining. We could go where we wanted, say what we wanted. It seemed so real that for a moment, upon waking, I thought it was true. Then I heard his footsteps in the hallway and knew we were still prisoners. But the dream was so real. Will it ever be? I closed the diary, silent tears streaming down my face. Yes, Mom, I thought. The dream has become real. We are free. We are our own masters now. It was at that moment, looking at the past, not with fear, but with the distance that time provides, that I realized something important. Our story of escape, of new beginnings, wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation, about taking the worst that life offered us and transforming it into strength, into wisdom, into the capacity to love and be loved. And this transformation, this path of healing and rediscovery, is what I want to tell in the next chapter. How we found the strength not just to move forward, but to truly live, to flourish despite the scars, to build a life worth living. The 1970s brought to America not only the end of the Vietnam War, but also profound transformations in how women viewed their place in society. And I, who had already broken so many chains, was ready to embrace these changes. My career as an elementary school teacher unexpectedly flourished. In 1972, I was invited to assume the role of educational coordinator at the school where I taught in Brooklyn. It was an immense challenge. I, who for so many years had been silenced, would now be responsible for guiding other educators, for defining paths, for making my voice heard in meetings where I was often the only woman present. I don't know if I'm prepared, I confessed to Charles one night after Cecilia had fallen asleep. We were sitting on our small balcony, sharing a cup of tea, the only luxury we could afford in those times of tight budget. Nobody is prepared for anything in life, he replied with that quiet wisdom that always calmed me. We learn by doing. If there's anyone who can transform a school, that someone is you, Dorothy. I accepted the position with the same mix of fear and determination that had accompanied me in all the major decisions of my life. I soon realized that education could be more than a job. It could be a mission, a way to prevent other children from going through what I went through. I implemented a special attention program for students who showed signs of problems at home. I trained teachers to identify signs of violence, not just physical, but emotional. I created a safe space where children could speak, be heard, be seen. You understand, don't you? A boy of 8 once said to me, eyes downcast, after telling me about his father who drank and broke everything at home. You look at us differently than other adults. He was right. I did understand. And that understanding, born of pain, became my greatest instrument of change. In 1974, I initiated a bold project for the time. Evening classes for mothers who hadn't completed elementary education. Many of these women, like Mom once was, were trapped in abusive relationships, without financial independence, without enough education to dream of something different. They won't come, warned the principal, a man of the old guard who had only given me the coordinator position due to insistence from the Board of Education, which wanted more women in leadership positions. Husband won't allow it. Small children at home. Heavy work all day. It's going to be a failure. On the first night, we expected 5 women. 23 showed up. The following week, 38. By the end of the month, we had 60 women enrolled of all ages, with life stories so diverse and yet so similar. We taught the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, but we also talked about rights, citizenship, possibilities. We discussed, with the necessary caution, how independence begins with small choices, small daily resistances. Mrs. Zulmira, a lady of almost 60 who had never held a pencil before, hugged me crying on the day she managed to write her own name. Now I can sign my documents, she said with a pride that literate people would never fully understand. I no longer need the ink-stained finger, the humiliation. This work with women led me to return to studies. In 1975, I entered the School of Education at Columbia University, a dream that seemed impossible for the girl I once was. Charles took on more classes to compensate for the reduction in my work hours. Mom and Mr. Oscar helped care for Cecilia on weekends when I needed to study. The university was a world apart. The discussions, even limited by the conservative climate of the mid-70s, opened horizons. I learned revolutionary educational theories, read Paulo Freire, clandestinely of course, debated with colleagues who, like me, believed that education could change lives. "You're different from most students," a professor once told me after a presentation I gave on adult literacy. "You speak with the urgency of someone who knows the problem from the inside, not just from theory." He was right. I wasn't there just for a diploma, for a better career. I was seeking tools for the silent revolution I had already initiated in my small Brooklyn school. It was during this period that Mom, at 51, decided to also return to studying. Inspired by my work with the women in the community, she enrolled in a professional dressmaking course. The student who once only sewed in secret, controlled by her tyrannical husband, now dreamed of having her own atelier. "It's never too late to be who you should have been," she told me when she proudly showed her first dress entirely created and made by her. Life wasn't easy. Balancing work, study, motherhood, and the trauma that now and then came back to haunt me in nightmares required a strength I didn't always believe I had. There were days when I broke down, when the weight seemed too great to carry. One night, after receiving a low grade on an important university paper, I cried as I hadn't cried in years. Charles found me huddled in a corner of the kitchen, hugging my knees like the frightened girl I once was. "I can't do this," I sobbed. "I'm not smart enough. I don't have the foundation. I don't have the time." Who was I kidding? Charles didn't try to convince me otherwise with empty words. Instead, he took a notebook and began to read aloud a text I had written for my literacy students. A simple story about a woman who planted a garden in a terrain that everyone said was arid. "This woman here," he said, pointing to the notebook, "who drew flowers from stones, who saw possibilities where everyone only saw limits. That's you, Dorothy, the same one who survived hell and transformed the experience into compassion for others." Those words hit me like a ray of clarity. I wasn't just fighting for my future, but for the future of so many other women and children who, like me, like Mom, lived trapped in situations that seemed to have no way out. I resumed my studies with renewed determination. I graduated in 1978 with honors, the oldest student in the class, the only one who was already a mother, who worked full-time, who carried invisible scars that somehow made me stronger rather than weaker. In the same year, I was invited to develop a pilot program to support families in situations of domestic violence for the Board of Education. It was delicate work, even more so in those times when the conservative values of the family were so strongly upheld. But I knew from personal experience how dangerous this thinking was, how it allowed monsters like my father to continue destroying lives behind closed doors, protected by society's complicit silence. The project was baptized with a purposely neutral name, Family School Integration Program. Behind this inoffensive facade, we created a support network that identified children at risk, offered psychological support, legal guidance, and when necessary, intervened to remove minors from dangerous environments. It wasn't easy. Resistance came from all sides, from within the board itself, from school principals who didn't want problems, from a society that still saw domestic violence as something private, almost normal. But gradually, case by case, we made a difference. I particularly remember a girl, Marianne, 13, who came to our program through an attentive teacher. She presented all the signs I knew so well: the downcast look, the silence, the startling at every sudden movement, the needle marks she tried to hide. When we finally managed to intervene, we discovered that her stepfather, a pharmacist, regularly drugged her with medications stolen from work. The story was so similar to mine that for a moment I felt as if I were looking at my own past. The difference is that Marianne didn't have to wait until she was 15 to escape, didn't have to plan her escape alone. There was now a network, small and imperfect, but existing, ready to support her. Seeing that girl months later, recovering her voice, her smile, her ability to dream, was confirmation that all the effort was worth it, that the sleepless nights studying, the sacrificed weekends, the constant battles against bureaucracy and prejudice were not in vain. By 1980, the program was already serving 12 schools in Brooklyn. It wasn't much considering the size of the city, but it was a start, a seed planted that would continue to grow in the following years. That same year, Mom realized her dream. She inaugurated a small atelier in Sunnyside with 2 industrial sewing machines bought in installments. "Margaret's Creations," said the modest sign in front of the shop, a tribute not just to her name, but to the dawn of a new life. Our paths, once so marked by fear and pain, now overflowed with possibilities. Cecilia, at 10, was a brilliant, curious, confident girl, everything I couldn't be in my childhood. Charles, always my safe harbor, had been invited to teach history at the same university where I had graduated. We had managed not just to survive, but to thrive, to transform the poison into medicine, the pain into purpose. We were no longer victims, but agents of change, each in our own way. In 1982, I received an invitation I never thought possible to give a lecture at an education conference in Washington, D.C. about our program to combat domestic violence. I, who had once been silenced in my own home, would now have a voice in a full auditorium, would be heard by educators from all over the country. The night before the trip, sitting on the porch of our house, now our own, bought with so much sacrifice, I looked at the stars and thought about the long journey that had brought me there. Not just the physical journey from Springfield to New York, but the inner journey from darkness to light, from fear to courage, from silence to speech. I thought about Mom's diary, about that dream of freedom she had so many years ago, at a time when freedom seemed impossible. I thought about all the women who, like us, still lived trapped in similar situations without seeing a way out, without imagining that another type of life was possible. And there, under the starry sky of a June night, I made a promise to myself. As long as I had strength, I would use my voice, my experience, my knowledge to open doors, to illuminate paths, to be the extended hand that Mom and I so needed one day. Because true freedom, I had learned, is not just in escaping from our prisons, but in helping others find their own keys. But this part of my story, how that small Brooklyn teacher became a national voice in the fight against domestic violence, how our program expanded to other cities, how we faced new challenges in the years of the Reagan era and beyond, that's for another day. In August 1982, I climbed onto the stage of the auditorium in Washington, D.C., with trembling knees and a racing heart. Facing an audience of 500 educators was more frightening than any nightmare about my father. But when I began to speak about our program, about the children saved, about the protection network we were building, something extraordinary happened. My voice, hesitant at first, gained strength. "Domestic violence is not a family problem," I declared, defying decades of complicit silence. "It's a social problem that demands collective responses." I ended my talk with a direct appeal. Each of you knows at least one child who goes to school carrying more than books on their backs. They carry fear. They carry shame. They carry secrets too heavy for them. Don't pretend you don't see. Don't do what so many did to me and to thousands of other children. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with emotion. Then slowly, the applause began. People stood up. Some were crying. At that moment, I understood that my personal story had been transformed into a tool for change. After the talk, dozens of educators sought me out. They wanted to know more about the program, how to implement it in their cities. Others, in private conversations, shared their own stories of abuse, guarded for years under layers of shame and fear. "You gave me courage," said a teacher from Boston, squeezing my hands between hers. "Maybe I too can transform what I suffered into something that helps others." I returned to New York with a folder full of contacts and an even greater mission. Our small local project now had the potential to spread, to grow beyond limits I never imagined possible. In the following months, I traveled to various cities in New England and neighboring states, always using my vacations or unpaid leaves. Money was tight, the exhaustion immense, but the determination greater than both. Charles, always my foundation, took on more responsibilities at home when I was away. Cecilia, now 12, already understood the importance of my work and even helped me organize materials for the lectures. "Mom is saving other girls," she would explain with simplicity, to friends who asked why her mother traveled so much. The pride in her voice was my greatest reward. In 1983, an unexpected event changed the course of our work. A case we dealt with, of a 10-year-old girl abused by her uncle, a doctor, reached the press. The New York Times published a full-page report with the title, "The Silence That Kills: The Hidden Violence in American Homes." The article talked about our program, about how we identified and helped children at risk. My name appeared several times as the coordinator of the initiative. The last thing I wanted was notoriety, but that exposure ended up being a watershed. The day after the publication, the school phone didn't stop ringing. There were educators wanting to know our methodology, social workers offering partnership, psychologists volunteering. But also, and this caught me by surprise, there were desperate mothers seeking help, teenagers gathering courage to denounce abuse, even men recognizing violent behaviors and asking for guidance. You opened a floodgate, the school principal, who had finally embraced our cause, told me. There's a lot of pent-up water there. He was right. Behind the facade of normalcy in American society, there existed an ocean of silent suffering, of naturalized violence, of victims without a voice. And somehow, our small program had become a bridge for these voices to finally be heard. It was during this time that the work began to gain a dimension I never imagined. The State Board of Education, impressed with the results, decided to expand the program to all public schools in the city. I was invited to coordinate this expansion, which meant leaving the classroom, my safe harbor for so many years. "You'll reach many more children this way," Charles argued when I shared my doubts with him. "You're not abandoning teaching. You're expanding your impact." I accepted the challenge with that mix of apprehension and courage that seemed to accompany me at all the crossroads of life. In the new role, I coordinated a team of professionals, trained educators, articulated partnerships with child protection agencies that were beginning to structure themselves in the country. The work was exhausting, often frustrating due to bureaucracy and resistance, but with each child protected, each family attended to, I felt I was paying a debt, not to my past, but to my present, to the girl who managed to escape and now had the duty to extend a hand to others. In 1984, while America lived through the Reagan years, our program took another important step. We established a partnership with the Columbia University School of Medicine to train health professionals in identifying signs of domestic violence. The irony didn't escape me. I, daughter of a doctor who used his knowledge to control and abuse us, now worked so that other doctors would use their knowledge to protect, to heal, to save. Dr. Maurice Gonzalez, a pediatrician who coordinated the project for the faculty, made this irony even more poignant. I discovered during our conversations that he had been a student of my father in Boston in the 60s. "I remember him as a brilliant but distant, cold professor," he commented once, without knowing of my connection to the man he was describing. The kind of doctor who knows everything about diseases and nothing about patients. I kept this coincidence to myself for months, unable to reveal the truth, until during a particularly intense training session on substance abuse in children, I felt it was the right moment. "Medical knowledge can heal or destroy," I said to the group of residents who were listening to us. "I know this firsthand. The doctor you admired, Dr. Maurice, was my father, and he used his knowledge to drug me, to control my mother, to transform our home into a prison." The silence that followed was electric. Dr. Maurice paled. Other doctors exchanged confused looks. But then something unexpected happened. One of the residents, a young man who barely seemed to have left adolescence, stood up with tears in his eyes. "When I was 10, my uncle, who was also a doctor, gave vitamins to me and my cousin when we stayed at his house. Only years later did I understand what those injections really were and why we remembered nothing afterward. It was as if a dam had broken." Other doctors began to share stories, not just of patients they had attended, but of their own childhoods, of abuses witnessed or suffered, of silences maintained for generations. "That's why I chose pediatrics," an older female doctor confessed, "to be the kind of doctor I needed as a child and never found." That moment of collective vulnerability, of truths finally spoken aloud, strengthened our partnership in ways I never imagined possible. The doctors ceased to be just professional allies and became companions in the cause, each bringing their own personal motivations. their own scars transformed into commitment. In 1985, with new winds blowing in American society, our program gained an official name that better reflected its purpose: Safe Haven, comprehensive protection for children and adolescents. We were no longer just an experimental pilot project, but a consolidated public policy with its own methodology, measurable results, and most importantly, recognition from society. Mom, now 60, followed my trajectory with a mix of pride and amazement. Her small atelier had grown. Now it had 3 seamstresses besides her and specialized in formal dresses. "Who would have thought," she would sometimes comment, that drugged woman without will of her own would come to have her own business, to see her daughter changing the lives of so many people. It was her idea that would open a new chapter in our work. Why not do something for the mothers too? Not just for those suffering violence now, but for those who, like me, managed to escape and are trying to rebuild their lives. That simple question gave rise to the New Beginnings Project, a support program for women who had left abusive relationships. We offered everything from legal guidance to professional courses, psychological support groups, and assistance in the search for safe housing. Mom became one of the most active volunteers, teaching basic sewing to women who, like her once, needed to find a way to support themselves after leaving behind everything they knew. "When I hold their trembling hands to teach them the first stitches," she told me once, "I remember my own hands, how they trembled for years after we left Springfield. The fear doesn't go away overnight. It's a slow process, like learning to sew, stitch by stitch, day by day." In 1986, our family experienced another transformation. Cecilia, at 16, announced that she wanted to study medicine. For a moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. The shadow of my father, which I believed I had finally exorcised, came back to haunt me briefly. "Are you sure, honey?" I asked, trying to hide my discomfort. Medicine is a difficult path. Her eyes shone in a way that reminded me of my own eyes so many years ago, when I dreamed of the same future before my father destroyed that dream. "I am, Mom. I want to be a pediatrician. I want to continue the work you started, but in my own way. I want to be for other children the doctor that you and Grandma needed and never had." At that moment, I understood that the circle was closing. The dream that was stolen from me now reborn through my daughter, not as a repetition of the past, but as its redemption. Charles, always sensitive to the invisible currents that moved us, perceived my emotion and put an arm around my shoulders. "The difference," he said softly, "is that she has both of us to support her, to protect her, to celebrate each step of her journey. She is not alone, as you were." He was right, as always. Cecilia carried not just my genes, my name, my repurposed dreams. She also carried the unconditional love I never received from my father, the freedom I fought so hard to conquer, the security of knowing that her worth didn't depend on her obedience or submission. The following years brought expansion and recognition to our work. Safe Haven spread to other states. The New Beginnings Project became a model studied internationally. I received invitations to speak at conferences, contribute to publications, participate in commissions that discussed public policies for women and children. In 1990, I was in Washington as part of a group of activists who fought to include in the legislation specific guarantees for the protection of children and adolescents. The emotion of seeing our efforts transformed into law, of knowing that now there existed a solid legal basis for the work we did, is indescribable. When I officially retired in 1997, at 51, it wasn't to rest, but to dedicate myself fully to the New Pathways Foundation, an NGO we founded to continue the work begun so many years before. The foundation's headquarters, a spacious house in Brooklyn adapted to our needs, became a safe harbor for hundreds of women and children each year. There we offered everything from temporary shelter to legal assistance, psychological support, professional courses, and educational monitoring for the little ones. Cecilia, now graduated in medicine and doing her residency in pediatrics, came on Saturdays to offer free care. Charles, retired from teaching, coordinated a scholastic reinforcement project for the sheltered children. Mom, despite her advanced age, still gave sewing classes twice a week. We were a family, not just of blood, but of purpose, united not just by our shared past, but by the commitment to a different future for other families. In 2000, an unexpected event brought the past back to my door. A letter arrived at the foundation, sent from Springfield. The sender, Sarah Olivins, the former housekeeper of our house, the silent witness to our suffering. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside, a brief letter written in uncertain letters and a yellowed newspaper clipping worn by time. Mrs. Dorothy, the letter said, I saw you on television the other day, talking about your work with children. I almost couldn't believe it. The frightened little girl I knew is now this strong woman helping so many people. I wanted to write to tell you that I never forgave myself for not doing anything back then. Fear paralyzed me, but that's no excuse. Today I'm an old woman with more regrets than years of life. But seeing what you have become gives me some comfort. Maybe God has a bigger plan than we can understand. The newspaper clipping was an obituary. Berenice Fields, widow of Dr. Gerald Fields, passed away yesterday at her residence, leaving 2 children and 4 grandchildren. My heart skipped a beat. Berenice? As far as I knew, my parents hadn't had any other children besides me. What did this mean? I called the sender that same day. Mrs. Sarah, now a lady of 85, told me between sobs that after our escape, my father had married again, a much younger nurse named Berenice. They had 2 children. According to her, he continued using his control methods with the new family. They say she tried to escape once, like your mother, Mrs. Sarah recounted. But he found her and brought her back. She never tried again after that. She lived like a ghost through the house, always drugged, always obedient. The news hit me like a punch in the stomach. While I was building a new life, while I was fighting to protect other women and children, my father had simply replaced his previous victims with new ones. The monster continued acting, just on another stage. The children, I asked, fearing the answer. How are the children? The boy killed himself at 20, she replied, her voice choked. The girl lives in New York, from what I hear. She never returned to Springfield after her father died. That conversation haunted me for weeks. Guilt gnawed at me from inside. What if we had denounced my father publicly instead of accepting the silent agreement that allowed us to start again, far away? What if we had exposed his crimes to the world instead of simply fleeing? How many other Margarets, how many other Dorothys could have been saved? Charles, perceiving my torment, gently reminded me, you were 2 women alone, without resources, without support, in a time when a doctor's word was worth more than any evidence. You did what you could with what you had, and look at everything you've built since then, all the lives you've saved. He was right, but that didn't completely erase the pain. I decided that I needed to do something, to seek a form of redemption, to close that circle that fate had reopened. With the help of contacts in the social area, I managed to locate my sister, whom I had never met, Marina Fields, 38, a history teacher at a public school in southern Manhattan, just a few miles from where I lived, without us ever knowing of each other's existence. The meeting in a neutral cafe was laden with emotion and discomfort. She had the same eyes as my father, the same chin, the same rigidly controlled posture that I recognized from my own past. Why did you want to meet me? She asked, straight to the point without preambles. What do you hope to gain from this? There was no simple answer. I wanted to apologize for not having prevented her suffering. I wanted to confirm that the monster of my childhood continued being a monster until the end. I wanted to offer help, solidarity, a belated bond of sisterhood. Perhaps to confirm that I'm not alone, I finally replied. That what we lived through wasn't imagination, wasn't exaggeration, that he really was what we know he was. Something in my words seemed to break a barrier within her. Her eyes filled with contained tears. Her fingers tightened around the cup with force. He said my mother was mentally ill, that she needed the injections to stay calm, she said in a low voice. He said it was for her own good, for our good. I believed it for years. Everyone believed it. We talked for hours, sharing stories so similar that they could have been lived by the same person at different times, the same prison, the same jailer, the same methods of control, the same impotence, the same fear, the same shame. When we said goodbye, it was already night. We exchanged phone numbers, promised to meet again, but both knew that the bond we shared was too complex to be called family, too heavy to be called friendship. "The work you do," she said in farewell, "is important. It's compensating for what you couldn't do before." Those words, more than anything else, brought some peace to the turmoil that consumed me. We cannot change the past. We cannot save those who are already gone, but we can transform our pain into purpose, our scars into maps that help others find the path to freedom. And that's what I continue to do to this day. At 79, with white hair and slower steps, but with the same determination that has moved me since that night in 1961, when a 15-year-old girl decided that she would no longer be a victim, but the architect of her own destiny. So my dear viewers, who watched this far, that's my story. A story of pain, yes, but mainly of overcoming, of transformation, of hope. If you're going through something similar, or know someone who is, know that there is a way out. There is help. There is life beyond fear and pain. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel, because no story of abuse should end in silence and solitude. Every story, no matter how painful, deserves the chance of a new chapter, of a new beginning, of a different ending than what seemed inevitable. Until the next video, with much love.